This lecture is over chapter 4, measuring physical activity. And so this chapter is all about just the different ways that physical activity can be measured, and then some of the pros and cons of each of those different styles. And so you'll want to know the different techniques, strengths and weaknesses, and so we'll kind of go from there. What do you think are some of the best ways to measure physical activity, maybe in an individual, but also in a population? And so what are some useful technologies out there? We'll kind of talk about all those things. You'll want to know things like accelerometers and cut points, domains, GPS waypoints, recall bias, and those things are kind of touched on, different kinds of software as well. Physical activity intensity, we know that physical activities of a moderate and vigorous intensity are more beneficial for health. We talked about that last time. And most measuring techniques focus on accurately measuring moderate and vigorous activity at an individual or population level. It's harder to measure some of the lower level of activities, especially in some of the ways that we'll talk about. There are different reasons that physical activity takes place. It can happen during free time, when you're just kind of wanting to. It could be based on transportation, so walking into a building could be part of your job or even household chores. And so that physical activity does vary in intensity and why people are doing it and how people are doing it. There is a difference between physical activity and exercise. Any kind of movement at all is going to count as physical activity, and those are good for us, and they help us with our health. And so those are there, but exercise, when we look at that, is slightly different than physical activity. Realize not all exercise or not all physical activity is going to be considered exercise, but all exercise will be considered physical activity. Typically, when you think of exercise as a recreational physical activity, it's where you're planning and have structured, repetitive motions of being physically active, and those will additionally help with your health, but it's basically planned times of physical activity is what we consider exercise. So in the last chapter, we talked about the physical activity recommendations for adults and children, about 30 minutes a day for adults, about 60 minutes a day for children, and trying to at least get up to those in any sense can help give you health benefits. So when it comes to measuring physical activity, there are many different ways to do that, and there are two ways that typically you look at measuring physical activity in a laboratory setting. And so those are indirect calorimetry and what's called doubly labeled water. These particular systems, we'll talk about them a little bit more, are best suited for lab-based, really small kind of group experiments. So you're not talking about measuring hundreds or thousands of peoples with these measurements. You're talking about measuring 5, 10, maybe 30 or 50 people, but things like that are in a clinical setting, so a doctor may use these. These particular measurements tend to be pretty expensive, especially initially. Startup costs with them. They are quite invasive, and that means that they take a lot of, the subject needs to participate and is going to have a number of things done to them, not always necessarily having anything put in them, but sometimes can be, but have to endure a lot of different things instead of just, being able to do the activity. But the good news is they are super accurate and precise. They give us the most amount of information, the best information, and we really know what we're getting with those. But not necessarily everyone needs those particular things. So when it comes to indirect calorimetry, what we're usually looking at is the amount of oxygen that someone is able to utilize from the air and how much carbon dioxide they're producing. This is done typically by hooking someone up to kind of like a face mask, and you breathe in room air, and then when you breathe out, it goes into a computer that measures all the oxygen and carbon dioxide and how much air you moved, and it collects that. And then based on some math equations that used to you had to do by hand, now you get to have the computer do them for you. You can actually start to measure how much energy someone is utilizing. And so with careful measurements and looking at the food that was eaten and other things and physical activity, you can really get a good estimate on someone's caloric expenditure, but how much physical activity they're doing, and be able to estimate with that. And so this is a great system, but it can be very expensive. You have to be put on a mask and hooked up to a computer, and they can be portable, and that increases the cost, but they're not necessarily the most comfortable to wear for many hours at a time, even though it can be done. The other way we have is what's called doubly labeled water. And so what happens is participants ingest a water that has some radioactive isotopes. Now, we're not talking radioactive in the sense of, Chernobyl, where you're going to get sick from it. It's a very, very controlled isotope, radioisotope, that can be measured. And so you consume this water that has this radioisotope in it. And then after a period of time, you will come back in and you'll have collected urine samples, and you can measure those isotopes in the urine. And based on how much is there, we can estimate, we can get a good idea of how much activity you've done and the energy you've expended during that. The good news about this is you kind of you take the doubly labeled water, you collect urine, you bring it back to the lab, and you can go on with everything else as normal. Usually you will have to write down some information about some things that you've done, but it's really good. But it does have some issues with it. It's super expensive. People have to collect it, come back and forth, and so it's good. But like I said, not everyone has access to that and being able to measure those things. So with that being said, we do have other ways that we can measure physical activity, and it could be through electronic devices. And when we get to this, we start getting an even more indirect way of measuring physical activity and how much energy is being burned, because we're using technology to kind of estimate it with this movement. So typically these electronic devices will measure some type of movement. There are different ways to do that. It removes anyone having to remember what physical activity they did and when and how much and how hard they think they were going. And so they can work in larger populations. They can give some pretty accurate measurements, but there are some limitations to those as well. Part of it is they do produce a large amount of data and require a lot of training and management systems to kind of pull out the data that's useful and analyze it to something that means something to people. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of numbers. They can be expensive, cheaper than the other systems, but can definitely be expensive when you start collecting a lot of these. And there's no information collected on what type of physical activity was done or when it was being done, where some of the other systems may actually give us those particular that information. So then, as again, we're kind of stepping down on the cost factor is kind of how this is laid out. The next thing we have is what's called an accelerometer. This is an electronic device that measures what direction you're moving and also how quickly you're moving and how big that movement is. And so this starts to actually give us some intensity related to it. It's converted into it turns your movement into a numerical number, and you can collect a whole bunch of data points in a matter of seconds. And so you got to think, if someone's wearing an accelerometer for an hour and they're getting 100 data points every second, that adds up very, very quickly, and you have to be able to go through that. And so this one has the same kind of as we were talking about these electronic devices, accelerometer is kind of a class in that and gives a lot of data that has to be analyzed. They also have what's called cut points, and it's based on energy conservation equations. And so these help to look at how much it was moving and how big, to kind of give us an idea of whether that was sedentary, light, or moderate activity. And it does give us a lot of information when all the data is processed of how often someone went, how long that was, what the intensity was, and total volume over time. So sometimes accelerometers are used, and they can be. They're, again, a little bit more accessible, can be expensive. But realize sometimes accelerometers can be used in conjunction with some of these other measurements, or maybe they're used in a standalone, which is all of these measurements can be used in multiple ways. So another thing that may be added to one of these tests or maybe used individually would be geographic positioning systems or GPS monitors. You guys may have used these before in some kind of app that you've had access to, or something along those lines, like a running app. A lot of times use these. So these collect your actual location, latitude, longitude on the globe, and they can do it every 60 seconds or every 5 seconds. So it's kind of tracking a map. It's not keeping track of you every single second, but over the course of time, you can see the movement and how quickly they got from point A to point B. And so it allows you to look at the velocity and acceleration of someone. It allows you to kind of see how much elevation they've climbed, a total distance, timestamps. It's really starting to narrow down a little bit more of that information and giving you some, but it's also missing some of those as well. You don't have that moment by moment look through time. So there are all kinds of software and algorithms that go in this to being able to tell the difference between sitting there and possibly riding in a car or a train versus biking and walking, which makes them pretty good to start telling modes of activity. And then, as I already stated, you can use a GPS and accelerometer together and get even more information, especially on activities that aren't people don't think about as much. So biking is a little hard to track, but together with an accelerometer and a GPS, you can get some more information. So from there, we move down in the spectrum to, again, a little bit cheaper, a little bit more simplistic in its use. Again, has good data, but has its limitations as well. And so those are pedometers. Really, you think about these as a step counter. Things like Fitbits, Apple Watches to some extent do this as well. They kind of combine several of these pedometers, GPS, accelerometers. They're really good for walking, running, jogging, that type of activity, using the lower body, upper body. Bicycling to some extent doesn't really work. Swimming, these don't necessarily work as well for, but kind of think your general step counter. And so the assumption is that every step counts as physical activity, but some of these can definitely count steps when you're not being physically active. Maybe you moved something or it shifted and didn't count. It doesn't necessarily, they can give us time frames in that. You can't really tell the intensity of it. It's just measuring steps. So again, adding that accelerometer data could be useful. But they are super expensive compared to the other measurement devices. I mean, you can get these for a couple bucks a piece and hand these out to thousands of people to be able to use and then get their data back at the end of it. And so there are some really good pedometers as well that cost more than that are meant for research. They're more accurate. And so you also have what we call consumer-based wearable tracking devices and apps. So this is the Fitbit, the Apple Watch, the Run apps that use usually a variety of these. They're typically wearables, or you're using your smartphone to get those. Typically, these are really meant just for tracking purposes. They give you information, feedback, and you can interact with other users, that type of thing. Some do give more information. Again, they have multiple things built in. And can be used for research and for good purposes. Just realize with all of these different wearable trackers, they're good for getting a baseline with someone and then seeing how that progresses over time. You can't necessarily compare what a Fitbit measures to what an Apple Watch measures or what your Run app measures. They're probably close, but not completely interchangeable because they all use their own kind of systems to do this. So again, not considered ideal for physical activity measurements. There's no standardized wearing position, which affects it. Think about someone wearing it on their wrist, and if they're a smoker, they would get more steps, more activity tracked, even though they weren't necessarily participating in more. So a good baseline measurement and trying to improve, but doesn't give us a true measure of that physical activity. And there's a lot of variation in those. So before we move on to the next way that people look at measuring physical activity, there's some terms here that you want to get familiar with. So reactivity, it's where someone acts differently when they know you're watching them. So if you were to get someone and you said, hey, we're going to track your activity for the next week, and you want to see what it's truly like, but they go out for walks that they don't normally do because they want to look like they're more active than they are. Could be response bias. So if someone's doing a survey and they give inaccurate responses because maybe they don't want to be seen in a certain way, or they just feel like they've done more physical activity, but it doesn't necessarily count in the way your survey is asking it. Or there could be recall bias, so you just don't recall things. Try to think about what you ate two days ago for lunch. Okay, some of you have a good idea, some of you don't. If we were to ask you that, more than likely you might have left out something, or the portion, the amount of it that you've eaten would be differently, and this applies to physical activity. And then social desirability bias, that's responding to a question based on what you feel others expect. So, did you exercise last week 3 times? If you think that I'm wanting a yes answer, you may say yes you did, even if you did. And so all of these are important when it comes to basically observational or survey types of measuring physical activity. And so direct observational measurements are where we're actually looking at these people and writing down and measuring their physical activity. Typically, you're a trained observer, researcher, you go through some training to know what to look for and what to identify. And so you're looking for who's participating and the intensity of groups of people, and you recognize certain characteristics of what qualifies a certain intensity. And it takes a little training to do so, but you can look at a real environment, and you can also do it a lot more people. You can look at them over time and kind of put that together. So typically it's done in group-based settings. Think like a gym setting or something like that. And so you can then start to estimate some energy expenditure based off of those as a group or individuals. So they're pretty good, but again, have their own limitations. There are systems for observing this, different ways to do it. So systems for observing fitness instruction time. So this is good for group-based levels of physical fitness. So think of a group exercise class. Got some listed here. And so measures the activity levels and participation levels and can be done in various sizes. There is also the system for observing play in recreation communities. So this is kind of thinking going out to a field and watching people be active. So a lot of different ways that this can happen. Can be parks, recreation centers, public squares, beaches. And again, you're looking at what people are doing and the intensity and how much. So more of an open system where people can be doing various things. And the SOFIT system is more everyone's kind of doing the same general things, and they have their own guidelines to direct you to get the information you're wanting. There are also self-reporting instruments like surveys. These are typically the most used. You'll see surveys used about physical activity. They're super cost effective. You can interview or survey thousands of people for sometimes next to nothing with the softwares that are out there now. The analyzing of them takes a little while, but you can get a lot of information and get a good idea of a collective, what a population looks like. They're very non-invasive. You can choose to do them or not. It's just some questions. You can skip questions in them. So most people are willing to do those. And you can measure all parts of physical activity from energy expenditure to intensity because you can form questions for that. The only problem is we have all of those recall and social biases and everything that we talked about, and the validity of the response and our questions worded to get the answers that you're looking for. So have I worded a question well enough to for people to consider answering what I'm wanting them? So when I ask about intensity, do they understand what I'm asking for and how to measure intensity? And am I getting the data that I'm looking for? Um, Realize surveys or self-reporting instruments can be questionnaire surveys. They can be interviews. They can be diaries that are kept. Diaries can be a little bit more active if people do them every single time they do physical activity because it's fresh on their mind and they just got done with it. And then you have some public health surveillance. So there are systems in place that are currently looking at public health, and the data is used to help figure out where there may be shortages. So surveillance of physical activity is just coming out. Like, how do we do this? There are trackers in public places that track how many people walk a certain direction back and forth versus using maybe an assisted system, so an elevator versus stairs. We're learning how to do those. And what can we do with that data? What does it mean at the end of the day? So a lot of times with these, there are questionnaires that go with them that you can see that are trying to gather larger information on lots of people and are listed globally and have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of responses and builds over time to track that. And so you're starting to see more efforts to look at it in a natural way, and how can we use that information. So there are also population indicators that help us to indicate how physical activity is going. And typically these are looking at non-physical activity measurements, but that can be related to that. So one example of this could be the risk of having a heart attack, or how many people have heart attacks. Well, if we look at the risk of heart attacks, or how many people are having heart attacks, and that's going up, well, we know that can be correlated or at least influenced by physical activity. And so if we implement a physical activity program and it has success, and we see that the risk of heart attacks and the amount of heart attacks goes down, we can kind of tie those together. And so there are many things looked at to indicate how people are doing with physical activity. And so you're looking at these, are people meeting certain guidelines? You look at environmental factors as well. So all of those we kind of look at, and there are a list of places right here that look at physical activity data in different ways and in different systems, and give ratings, and that you can utilize just to see that measurement, especially on a large population level. And so really what it comes down to is you've got to find the right set of measurements for your project or whatever you're doing, whether it's working with an athlete or an average person or doing research. And so you have to look at risk benefit. What's the cost of it? What kind of information am I trying to get? How many people am I trying to get that information from? And so over time, you're going to realize what may work best for something. And as you learn, the best approach typically is to combine several of these. That way you have several different ways of measuring the same kind of data, and hopefully it all comes up as similar. It won't be exactly the same, but it comes similar patterns, and that gives us good indication we were measuring what we wanted to measure. If it ever becomes completely different, we may need to stop and figure out, okay, what do we need to do to get the information that we're looking for? And part of what you have to look at is, are you looking at a large population or a few people? Are you looking to be the most precise, or to get just a general idea of physical activity? And so those are some of the things to look at. And, what you have access to can sometimes play a role in this as well. Because if you don't have access to something, it's really not on the table for you to utilize. So this is just kind of a chart that kind of drags those out so you can see them, kind of what we've already talked about. But on the y-axis, you're looking at clinical relevance. How precise is it? Usually individual level, cost, and invasiveness. So the more precise, the more expensive it is, the more intensive it is, the higher up it's going to be here. And then public health relevance, so how easy is it to use in a natural environment? And what you can see is typically those that are cost more invasive at an individual level aren't as well for measuring a large group of people in everyday activities. And those that are reverse of that tend to go in this negative style line here. And so with that, we kind of covered everything we needed to. And so make sure you look over your chapters in it. Go to the online resources. They'll be good at helping direct some of this as well. And let me know if you guys have any questions over this particular topic.